Okay, this is the 140-160 class, and we're going to do some literary warm-up. For the record, I want to thank Nancy and Lori and the other students who showed me around this fine place and showed me what they do here. I thank you for that. What we are doing here today to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the School to Work program is really adapting to the information age in the 21st century, one of the oldest traditions in the United States. Just imagine, for example, here we are in Maryland. What if we were here 200 years ago? You would be a young person living in a settlement in Maryland called Port Tobacco, which was then a big town around these parts. You'd be in a promising new country. George Washington would be your president. John Adams would be your vice president. Pretty good lineup. And everybody would be optimistic, and most people would be like Nancy. They'd get up at 5 a.m. or 5:30 a.m. every day, ready to go to work. If you wanted a better job, you'd probably leave the country and come into town, where you would walk down a main street and you would look at the people who were working. 200 years ago, you'd see a blacksmith, a carpenter, and of course a printer. If you wanted to learn how to do those jobs, you'd simply knock on one of the doors and hope that in return for hard work, you could get a craftsman to teach you those skills. That's the way it was done 200 years ago. And for a long time, that's the way it was done, as one generation kept faith with the next. Well, we know that we can't exactly do it that way anymore, but if you think about it, that's what the School to Work program is all about in modern terms for the modern economy, and it's very, very important. This year, we are seeing grants that involve over 100,000 students nationwide, over 40,000 employers, including very large and very powerful employers in this country, but also some very, very small ones. And there are over 2,500 schools all across America involved in this program. The act was a genuine partnership. It set up no bureaucracy, whatever. It simply made grants to local partnerships, many of them in poor areas, and gave students the chance to show what their hard work could do. This year, we are doubling the School to Work funding for the 8 pioneer states that already have programs. Seed grants will go out to 20 new states so that all 50 states will have some participation in the School to Work program. By 1997, every state in America will have a School to Work program up and running. One thing that I want to emphasize that is very important is that the School to Work program rests on a few very big ideas. One of the ones that's most important to me is that there is no choice to be made between practical workplace skills and academic knowledge, that the two reinforce each other and go hand in hand. When I was growing up, there was always this bright line between what was a vocational or practical skill and what was an academic skill. It was probably a mistake then, as it is certainly a mistake now. We have to abolish that line. School to Work is for all kinds of students. After high school, some will go straight to a job, some will go on to a community college, others may go to a 4-year college. Some who hadn't planned on getting more education will get more education because they were in the School to Work program and because they see it will help them in their work lives. Our country has enormous potential and a few very large problems. You know what they are as well as I do. You know we have too much crime and violence. You know we have major pressures on the family and the community in our country. What you may or may not know is that underlying a lot of this is the fact that more than half the people in this country today are working a longer work week than they were 10 years ago for the same or lower wages. And the reason is we have not created in this country the kind of education and training programs we need to adapt to a global economy where everybody's earnings are to some extent conditioned on the pressures being put on us from around the world, and where everybody's earnings more and more depend upon not only what they know, but what they are capable of learning. In the last 15 years, for example, earnings for high school dropouts in the workforce have dropped at breathtaking rates. They're about 25% lower than they were 15 years ago. Earnings for high school graduates are not down that much, but they're also down significantly. The only people for whom earnings have increased in the last 15 years are people who get out of high school with usable skills and have at least some kind of education and training for about 2 years after high school. It can be in the workplace, it could be in the service, it could be in a community college, it can be in a college, but you have to create this sense of ongoing upgrading of the skills if we're going to grow the middle class and shrink the underclass in this country. If we could do that, a lot of our other problems would be smaller. I want to emphasize again that this has been a bipartisan effort, which perhaps ought more properly to be a nonpartisan effort. After all, in the Cold War era, there are certain things that are critical to the American dream. Growing the middle class and shrinking the underclass and giving people the chance to help themselves is clearly that. We ought to have partisan differences over how best to achieve that goal, but we ought to be committed to that goal. And if you're committed to a goal, very often you wind up agreeing on the details. For example, there's been a remarkable amount of bipartisan support in the United States Congress and in the administration on what the defense budget ought to be at the end of the Cold War. Everybody knows it has to go down, and everybody knows it shouldn't go down too much, because every time in our history we've taken it down too much, we have wound up getting ourselves in trouble, and we have to build it up all over again. Better to spend enough money to maintain the strongest military in the world to prevent bad things from happening. So we argue a little bit around the edges, but more or less we are moving in the same direction because we understand that's important to our security. The same thing could be said today about the other problems we have. We have two big deficits in America today. We've got a huge government budget deficit, but we also have an education and training deficit, and we can't solve one without the other. We ought to bring both into balance. We ought to get rid of both deficits, and I think we can. In the last 2 years, we've made a remarkable amount of progress. Over a 7-year period, the budgets that were adopted in the last couple of years reduced the deficit by $1 trillion. Your budget deficit would be gone today. We would be in balance today, were it not for the interest we have to pay on the debt we ran up in just the 12 years before I took office. And this is some jury charge warm-up for the record. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today I am going to address you and talk to you about the law that you must apply during the course of your deliberations. As has been said before, and I will say it to you one more time to make it legal and official, when it comes to what the facts are in this case and what happened at the Bluebell Inn on the evening of November 8, 2011, if anything did happen out there, this is for you to decide. You decide what happened, who did what, who was there, and what are the facts that you want to believe. You are the judges of the facts in this case. Your judgment is important in deciding what the facts are to be believed. You are the sole and exclusive judges of the facts. Ask yourself what took place at the Bluebell Inn. Ask yourself questions about the case, just as the lawyers have asked each of the witnesses questions about the case. What we lawyers say is not what happened. It is not what each individual witness said happened. It is what you decide happened based upon the evidence in reaching your conclusions. The lawyers in their summations talked at length about the testimony. Now, during the course of my jury charge, I will talk about the testimony as given by the witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in reaching your decision as to what happened at the Bluebell Inn, you have to rely on your own recollection of what the testimony was that was given. Your recollection of that testimony is the most important part of this trial. I will assure you at this time, if I state some small portion of testimony, and it differs from what you recall, you must rely on your own recollections. I assure you that none of us here in the courtroom, the attorneys or anyone else, are deliberately trying to mislead you or attempt to mislead you by misstating what the testimony was. We may by accident misstate it, but it is not a deliberate act on our parts. You must rely on your own recollection, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, of what the testimony was. One of your main and important functions is to decide who you believe. You decide what you believe. You decide which witnesses you believe. And then in arriving at that decision, as far as which witness to believe and what part of their testimony to believe, you should use your common sense and sound judgment that you use in your daily lives to make your decision. In life, we are all called upon to make decisions. We must decide whether or not to believe a story that someone told us. You must make that decision on a daily basis. Well, use your same common sense here, your same judgment that you use in your everyday life to determine which witnesses you believe and what portion of their testimony you are going to believe. You may believe all of their testimony, none of it, or some of it. During the course of the trial, you had the opportunity to see and hear the witnesses while they were on the stand. You watched them testify. The credibility of a witness has to be determined by you. You must evaluate the witness's demeanor while testifying, their mannerisms while testifying, and how they responded to the questions asked of them. Did you notice that the witness hesitated on certain questions? Did the witness try to evade answering a question? Was the witness reluctant at any time to offer an answer? Were the answers direct and to the point? You may also consider along these lines the credibility of each of the witnesses. You must evaluate whether or not a witness was interested in the outcome of this trial. Did they have a personal interest or a personal gain in the outcome of the trial? If they did, this might cause a witness to testify in less than an accurate manner. If you find that any witness did have an interest in the outcome of the trial, that witness is not necessarily entitled to less credit than another witness who has no interest in the outcome of the trial. And you may find that anyone who did stand to lose or gain by the way they testified in this trial, you may consider that in assigning weight to individual testimony. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, during your deliberations, it must be the quality of the testimony that should guide you and not the actual quantity. You cannot say that the side with 35 witnesses had more believability than the side with 4 witnesses. That should not enter your mind. You should be only interested in the quality of the testimony. If you find that any witness here has testified falsely in regard to some material issue, you are at liberty to disregard that witness's entire testimony. You can remove it from your mind if you find that a witness testified falsely as to any material allegation, but again, you are not required to do so. You may take a witness's testimony and use the only portion that you find to be truthful, and then you may disregard that portion that you deem to be false. If you feel that a witness made an honest mistake while testifying, assign an appropriate weight to that testimony. Remember, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that an honest mistake is an honest mistake. It is not done willfully. With an honest mistake in the witness's testimony, you as members of the jury must decide whether the testimony was true or false and assign it some type of weight along with the overall testimony given in the courtroom. Expert testimony was presented in the courtroom. Expert witnesses are allowed to give opinions on a variety of subjects once they have been qualified as an expert. The law feels that people who are trained and educated in certain fields are more prepared to come forward and give conclusions and opinions on certain topics as opposed to the opinion of a lay witness who is not an expert. That expert opinion can be offered by both sides in a trial. You are to assign to each expert the weight that you feel should be given according to the facts that were presented by them. We have 12 experts on the stand during this trial, and each one offered opinions and conclusions on what took place at the Bluebell Inn last year. Some of the experts' opinions differed, so you are to decide which expert to believe in whole or in part. At this time, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will bring in the alternate jurors to be sequestered along with you in the jury room. Please remember the admonition. Thank you for your undivided attention here today.